my privilege to introduce our keynoter. And I think at a conference like this, the thing that makes a keynoter is he gets introduced and he has no discussant. So we're really thrilled that Sheridan Titman came up from Austin, or over from Austin. I still have Madison in my head sometimes. Over from Austin to be our keynoter today. As you know, very distinguished career, spent some time here in Los Angeles down the 10, has written about all kinds of things, particularly about capital structure, about urban growth. And one thing I couldn't help but look it up. So there are a number of people in this room who have 10 to the 4th citations in Google Scholar. Sheridan has over 70,000 citations in Google Scholar. So if nothing else, he gets people talking about things. Again, thanks for being here, Sheridan Titman.
As Richard mentioned, I've spent most of my time in finance. I actually started my graduate studies, at least 1 year, trying to understand urban economics. And these models are a lot of moving pieces. So it seemed a little bit too complicated for me. So I switched to corporate finance. In the last few years, I'm back trying to understand the stuff that I never could understand as a graduate student. The types of issues that I want to talk about today are similar in some sense to what Jill's just talked about in terms of his model, but I have a distinctly sort of finance perspective thinking about some of the same issues. So I'll start by just saying, what do financial economists think about when we think about geography? And the key, which is really what I'm going to focus on today, is risk and volatility. Okay, so you know, when I read the urban literature, I sort of see very little where they talk about what makes some cities risky versus other cities, what makes real estate risky. The finance guys are obsessed with this. So there's a whole literature on pricing mortgages. And the price of a mortgage, the credit risk of a mortgage is, of course, determined by the volatility of the underlying real estate. We value properties. Thinking about cap rates, the value versus the earnings, all those things are about volatility to a large extent. The last point is about options to develop. Okay, when do I actually time my development? Obviously, we all know that I'm going to wait longer to develop a property if there's more uncertainty in the environment. Okay, so almost everything I've thought about in terms of real estate finance is tied to volatility. But volatility, to understand that, you have to understand how the cities are configured. Okay, so the volatility doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of something that finance people know nothing about, and it has to be something to do with the urban economics. So the way I want to think about this is what's exogenous in the model is total factor productivity. So in that sense, it's very similar to what we've just seen. There's going to be an exogenous element of total factor productivity. Okay, so cities are hit by shocks. And, you know, if I'm in Houston, it could be an oil price shock. If I'm in Seattle, it could be some sort of technology shock. There's going to be different exogenous TFP shocks in different cities. Okay, that's exogenous. Okay, there's going to be an endogenous element to the TFP shock because we're going to assume there's agglomeration economies, there's externalities. So if my city grows in the same sense we just discussed, it's going to make everybody in the city more productive. Okay, so that's going to be an amplifying effect of these exogenous TFP shocks to get an endogenous TFP as well. And we're going to also look at other aspects that are going to dampen the effect of these TFP shocks. Okay, so we talked about congestion, for example. Those can dampen the shocks. We also like to think about things like serial correlation and persistence. Okay, so if the shock is hitting me today, what does that imply about changes in, say, TFP, changes in rent, changes in value next year? Okay, so we know that rents tend to be serially correlated what do we need in a model to generate that kind of serial correlation? And what's actually more important, and what I'll emphasize more today, is differences in rent-to-value ratios across cities. Okay, so if I have a shock to Southern California that's positive, okay, and I think it's going to persist, okay, so I think rent's going to grow over time in Southern California because of this shock that's going to persist, then the rent-to-value ratios in Southern California is going to be lower than in a city which hasn't been hit by this shock. Okay, so the finance guys are obsessed with valuation. The way we talk about valuation is the value relative to the rent. Okay, so we'll talk a bit about that. Value creation. Okay, I won't talk a lot about value creation. When I was here about a year and a half ago, I presented something. This is co-authored with Chris. Oh, by the way, my co-author on the paper I'll talk about, Goshan Ju, he was actually at UT as a graduate student when Chris was there. Chris didn't remember him, but he was in the econ department. But Chris and I are thinking a lot about what we'll call value creation. And value creation is the value of a business relative to what you put into the business. Okay, so if Amazon's worth $800 billion, but the amount of capital put into Amazon is $200 billion, then in some sense $600 billion has been created. Okay, so we like to think about value creation, and another way to think about that from the point of view of the urban economists is to what extent are the firms in the city capturing part of the benefits of this TFP shock. Okay, so I'll think a little bit about that within the context of the model. The observation that Chris and I have is that these market values to book values, market value to replacement values, those are very different in different cities. Okay, now the city, also I just want to mention that the cities with high house prices tend to be the cities with the high market to book ratios. That's interesting, and I think we need to think more about that. And if we have time at the end, we can talk more about that. The one point that I want to leave you guys just to remember from this slide, this is sort of a salient fact I think all the urban economists should know about, is that 80% of the value created by new public companies in the last 50 years were public companies in just 2 different metropolitan areas. Okay, I'm pretty sure you guys know which 2 it is, but you're all surprised that it's 80% of the total market cap, or the total market value created in the entire United States. It's all from the Bay Area and Seattle. Okay, actually if you look worldwide, it's just very few cities has created the bulk of the value in terms of new companies being created. So you'd have to add to this 2 cities in China, Shenzhen and Hangzhou. In terms of value creation. So in terms of corporations doing things, it's very, very concentrated, very much the case in terms of agglomeration. So we won't talk too much about that. We can get that kind of result within this model, and we can talk about that more. I'm not going to stress that as much. Okay, so what are we doing here? Sort of my unit of analysis is central business districts. Okay, so I'm thinking of the world as a system of central business districts more than a system of cities. Okay, because I'm thinking of each central business district as being surrounded by residential areas. And in some sense, I can think of downtown LA and sort of the Century City, Beverly Hills area as 2 different CBDs in 2 different cities. I'm not going to be too worried about how close these are to each other. Okay, now to the extent that they overlap, it's going to give me a problem. But again, the unit of analysis is central business districts because I want to think in terms of the value being created within the central business district and people commuting from the periphery into the central business district to work. So it's just sort of the standard monocentric city model. The firms in the central business district produce consumption goods using land, labor, and capital. Okay, so we've got standard Cobb-Douglas production functions. The land in the CBD is fixed. Okay. The labor and the capital are mobile. Okay. Now, in our static model, we're going to assume the capital is perfectly mobile. Okay. When we get an equilibrium in a static model, we're going to move to dynamics, where I'm going to slow down the migration of capital, but not the migration of labor. Okay. Again, consistent with Gill's model, there will be a reason to slow down labor if the incumbent labor can vote and say, let's keep out workers for a while. There will be that incentive, which we don't look at, in the same way that the incumbent capitalists would like to keep out other firms. Okay? The workers consume the consumption good and must travel to the CBD at a cost. This is all very standard. And we've got these exogenous shocks to productivity. And what we're interested in is the effect on how these shocks can be amplified by agglomeration, dampened by congestion. Okay. So the ultimate questions: how does urban structure affect real estate risk? Okay, so we're going to talk about different ways cities may be configured. We're going to take that as exogenous and then ask the question of, does that affect the riskiness of the real estate within the firm? And the congestion costs are going to be determined by the transit technology, which could be different in different cities, and also sort of the different physical aspects of the city. Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Las Vegas because we've got Ed here who's lived in Las Vegas, and he can basically correct everything I have wrong. The reason why I want to pick on Las Vegas is that I want to think about an episode in the early 2000s and the financial leading up to the financial crisis. And there's a lot of discussion in the literature, and they like to use Las Vegas as sort of the poster child of sort of excesses leading up to the crisis, and the idea that there's something kind of funny about Las Vegas that people talk about, which is that it looks like a city that's not particularly constrained. Okay, and our view is that if we're in a city that's not particularly constrained, we get a shock to total factor productivity. What should happen is that the size of the city increases, but the prices of the real estate don't move very much because there's plenty of supply of it. Okay, so I want to revisit sort of that experience and look again at the fact that it looks a little bubbly in some sense, in the sense that the price of land in Las Vegas goes up from something like $150,000 an acre to about $700,000 an acre. And rent in Las Vegas does go up, but not very much. Okay, so the question is, you know, what's going to cause the land to go up so much, even though rent goes up just a little bit? So we want to think about that and think about, you know, before we throw away all of our sort of standard models and go into behavioral stuff. Most of the discussion of Las Vegas has been more behavioral. I want to try to resurrect some sort of explanation based on a fairly standard monocentric city model. So again, this is how I'm thinking about rent, in the sense of I have a shock, prices move, rents move. How should they move together? And in what type of cities do we expect the rents to move a lot from such a shock? And what kind of cities do we expect this population to increase without the rents increasing a lot? Okay. And what I mean by the observed dispersion in cap rates, it's again, Las Vegas, you could say the cap rate went down a lot, in the sense that prices went up and rents didn't. And we can also think about cap rates across cities and how they're likely to be different. Okay, so again, just to emphasize, these questions are very much related. Okay, so we've got shocks to cities. The shocks are going to move prices, are going to move rents. They may move them differently in different cities. So I can think in terms of volatility, serial correlation, differences in cap rates. These are all related concepts, okay, which is what finance guys like to think about. Okay. I'm being a little bit redundant, putting the same concepts on the different slides, but just want to remind you again, we want to know how the urban rents and values are determined by the characteristics. The characteristics are transportation, infrastructure, physical development constraints, okay, whether you have, big lakes and rivers within your city, whether you have rail lines moving in and out of your cities, the industry structure. When I say that, I basically am talking about the agglomeration externalities. Okay, in some cities, in some industries, proximity is extremely important. In other industries, it's not so important. Okay, in finance, it's extremely important. The finance industry seems to have the most agglomeration externalities, and if you look around the world, and I've done this, the cities, the best explanation for CBD rents across the world is the number of Bloomberg terminals in the city. Okay, so the cities with lots of Bloomberg terminals, they have very, very high rent relative to cities without Bloomberg terminals. And the types of comparisons I like to make is between, say, like Sydney, Australia, and Melbourne. Income levels are the same. They're very good comps for each other, but there's 10 times as many Bloomberg terminals in Sydney as there is in Melbourne, and office rents in Sydney are almost twice what they are in Melbourne. Okay, and you can compare Shanghai to Guangzhou, you can compare Frankfurt to Munich, all those comparisons. But anyway, so the different industries are going to have different agglomeration externalities. Okay, so oil companies like to cluster in Houston, but their benefit of proximity is not so high, so they're scattered all over Houston. So you don't have high office rents in Houston as a result of that. Okay. We have a general equilibrium urban model. Okay. We're looking at land rent elasticities with respect to the exogenous component of TFP. And once we sort of worked out those details, okay, we've got a fairly simplistic dynamic model that we're going to be basically simulating to try to understand issues relating to things like cap rates, serial correlations, and so on. Okay, the dynamic model is fairly simplistic, okay, because we're using fairly, well, the way that capital adjusts to shocks is exogenous. We're assuming that in any given year, okay, we solve for the optimal amount of capital we would have. We look at the amount of capital that we have today, and we're assuming that we can only move towards the optimal 20% per year. Okay, if we wanted to solve this as a full-blown dynamic model, you'd want to solve for the optimal path for capital over time that takes into account sort of this real option effect. You're going to optimally be waiting to build and all those sorts of things. So we've got a fairly simple way of solving the dynamic model. If you want to put migration costs on the workers, it's similarly very complicated to solve for the optimal migration decision in a dynamic model, and we don't do that. Okay? So that's what we're doing. And I don't have a discussant, so you guys should feel free to ask me questions as we go along. Okay. Monocentric city model. Competitive firms in the CBD produce consumption goods using land, labor, and capital. Land's in fixed supply. In the static version, the land and capital move to the more productive cities immediately. This is sort of the simple static version, just to come up with the steady state equilibrium. The important point here is that in this particular version, okay, since labor and capital move freely, okay, all the benefits associated with being in a superior location is going to be borne by the landholders. Okay, and so it's sort of like the former model where the land is all being held by absentee landlords. Jill was saying it's a mutual fund that holds all the land and divides the proceeds. It's that type of thing. We're not modeling the landowners. They're going to capture all the benefits in this model. Okay, but when we move to dynamics and slow down the movement of capital, okay, then the firms are going to be able to capture some of the benefits of the shock. Okay, so workers consume the consumption good and land in the periphery and travel to the CBD at a cost. This is all very standard. There's exogenous shocks to productivity, and we want to see how they're amplified. And again, I guess this is going to be important in terms of the dynamics because we want to know what's going to generate the persistence. There's two things that are generating persistence. So you get a positive shock. Okay, the benefits, okay, when I get a positive productivity shock, people migrate to my city. Okay, after they've migrated to my city, there's more people in my city, and we're assuming with more people, everyone's going to be more productive. Okay, but in the dynamics, that takes one period to happen. Okay, when everyone's more productive, and the firm is basically deciding how much to invest, if the total factor productivity is higher, then capital, the optimal amount of capital that I'm going to invest is going to be higher. Okay, so that's going to further increase the marginal product of labor. Okay, if the marginal product of labor is higher, then wages are higher. Wages are higher, that's going to cause more workers to move to my city. That's going to cause more agglomeration benefits, and then that's going to cause the firms to use more capital, and so on and so forth, and the whole thing just sort of snowballs over time. Okay, so what's going to basically stop this snowball is the fact that as the city gets bigger and bigger, the new workers that come to my city, they're going to have to live farther away. And if they have to move farther away, that means they're going to have to pay more to commute. Okay, if they have to pay more to commute, they're willing to pay more to live close into the city. So that's going to cause rents to go up as well. Also, as I have more workers working in my central business district, okay, the workers are going to be more productive if they have some land in the production function. Well, I've got more capital, more labor. The demand for land is going to be higher for the firm. So the firm is going to end up having to pay more for rent in the commercial center, and they're going to have to pay higher wages because the workers on the margin are commuting in farther. Okay. At some point, even though the city is extremely productive as it's growing, it's going to be the case that the shortage of land in the central business district and the higher rents, plus the higher wage costs caused by the commuting costs, all of those things are going to make the firms basically say, yeah, it's extremely productive, but it's still too expensive to work here. Okay, so that's basically the equilibrium. And again, I think it shares a lot of the same concepts as what we've seen before. Okay, so the assumption is that the central business districts are located where they're located. And so we're not allowing a new central business district to emerge right on the periphery. Right. But yeah, I think that's really the logical next extension to that. And again, I'm not sure how to think about that, but I think that's a good point. If you look at the financial districts, and I think maybe in that sense finance is special, we've got Midtown Manhattan, which is kind of special in terms of the agglomeration benefits, and we don't see anyone, we see the Wall Street firms putting their back office in Jersey City, but it's not the same thing. While in Houston, that's exactly what happens. Okay, so we've got a bunch of oil companies in a certain part of Houston, okay, but as that got more expensive, there aren't huge agglomeration economies. There's not a huge benefits of proximity, so Exxon moved out to the Woodlands, which is 12 miles away, because they don't need to be right next to BP. Okay, so that's very, very important in terms of the evolution of these cities. Okay, but again, in some sense, that's consistent with the model. What I'm worried about from the model's point of view is what are the agglomeration economies for the firms in that CBD? You know, are they tight enough to keep them all there in some sense? And I'm thinking if they're moving out, that's like they're moving to a different city, not just to a different part of the city. So if you look at Silicon Valley, I mean, these firms are very tightly clustered right here. I'm not saying it's the only cluster. The point is this.
There are multiple clusters.
Yeah. So again, my unit of analysis is what I'll call the CBD. Okay. So I would say this is a CBD that's very tightly clustered, and extremely productive. Okay. So this is very consistent with the way I'm thinking about things. Now, if you say there's something out here, which is the second CBD.
But you know, 50 miles north of San Francisco.
That's fine.
And then halfway in between around
Yeah.
Palo Alto.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem with saying, that's why I want to emphasize that my unit of analysis isn't the metropolitan area, it's the CBD. Okay, so I'm asking the question.
So you can have multiple CBDs within a metropolitan area. Okay.
Yeah. And now, again, you say it's a weakness of the analysis or not, but I'm not taking into account the benefits of, saying, having two CBDs closely located. I'm not saying, well, there's agglomeration benefits for having these guys close to San Francisco. Okay, so I'm not thinking about it that way. Okay, yeah, this is the thing with Houston, just basically saying that you had, you know, most of the oil companies were here, but Exxon moved up there. So these things happen. But the point is, if you have really strong agglomeration externalities that keep firms from wanting to do that, okay, that's going to be important in terms of the implications for things like commercial rents and things like that. Okay, so the fact that you have the multiple CBDs is just an indicator that the agglomeration externalities or the value of extreme proximity just isn't that high. Okay, I'll go through this quickly. Just again, these are things I've already said, and the point is that in the competitive model, you know, when all the factors of production are movable except for the land and everything's competitive, then the land captures all the benefit. Okay, so this is just how we're modeling the total factor productivity. Is we've got that A tilde, which is the exogenous element of total factor productivity, and we multiply it times n to the lambda power, which is basically showing how my total factor productivity is amplified by the population. The size of the CBD is exogenous, okay, and we've looked at cases where the size of the CBD can be expanded. Okay, the way I'm thinking about this is that there's benefits of proximity, and I could say, okay, this is how big I can be to have the benefits of proximity. And if I just allow that to expand, in some sense, you're cheating, because the equilibrium is going to be basically everyone's going to be in exactly the same city, because we're letting this business district get as big as it needs to be. Okay. And again, this is very much like the previous paper, where you've got on the periphery, you've got land that has some alternative use, like agriculture, that sort of pins down the prices. And one thing that we've got here that most people don't put into these models is the share of undevelopable residential land. Okay, so we don't necessarily have a featureless plain. We've got parts of this plain that you can't build. It could be because they have water, mountains, or whatever. Not everything is buildable in the city. Okay, so there's three endogenous prices that we need to solve for. There's the wage rate, the commercial land rent, and the residential land rent. Okay, again, they're going to be different because the city is segmented into a CBD and a residential area. There's four endogenous quantities: the size of the city, the amount of capital, and the endogenous type of the total factor productivity. So we basically have 7 equations and 7 variables. They're not linear equations, so you don't necessarily get a unique equilibrium. You don't always get an equilibrium under some parameter values. The city will basically grow without bounds, and everyone will live in the same city. So you can get various types of equilibrium here. So roughly speaking, I like to think about it as you can think about the aggregate supply of labor. You know, that's how many workers want to live in my city, and the aggregate demand for those workers, how many people the firms within the CBD want to employ. Okay, so the effective expansion constraints. Okay, there's sort of a couple ways to think about that. One is the amount of, say, undevelopable land. Okay, so if I've got a featureless plain, you know, just with a circle here, everything along that periphery can be developed. Okay, so if I've got a shock, I can expand the city, you know, without any of these constraints. Okay, now it may be that the city is surrounded by water or rivers or mountains or whatever, in which case there's only one, say, corridor which can be expanded. Okay, so that's one form of expansion constraints. Okay, the other form is that we're assuming that as the city grows, okay, there's a congestion effect. Okay, so the time it takes to travel 10 miles in a city with 5 million people is going to be less than the amount of time it costs me to travel 10 miles if there's 10 million people. Okay, so as the city grows, it becomes more congested, so traveling the same distance is going to take more time, and it's going to be more costly. Now we're going to assume that if our city is car-based, like Los Angeles is to a large extent, okay, the congestion costs are going to grow faster than if it's rail-based. Okay, so at least to begin with, if I basically am transporting people by rail, rail becomes more efficient the more people you have using the rail, while the highways become less efficient the more people you have on the highways. So we can think about it, rail versus car, as changing the parameters in our transportation function. Okay, so this is Seattle, and this is what we've talked about before. You've got all these tech companies are basically located here. We'll sort of think of this as the main CBD for Seattle. Okay, so the point here is that Seattle is surrounded by water. You don't have a big rail line going into Seattle. You've got 2 bridges here getting people into this area. You could think of Seattle as a very constrained city. Okay, putting Microsoft out here is just basically reminding us that they don't necessarily have to be in the CBD. Okay, but the fact that all these guys want to be in the CBD is suggesting that there's very strong agglomeration economies that offset the fact that it's very difficult to get into the CBD from out here. Okay, so the question we're going to ask is, with all this water surrounding Seattle, does that make Seattle's property more volatile or less volatile? Okay. Okay. In the model, which I think is fairly clear, CBD rents are lower if it's hard to get workers into your city. Okay, so that should be relatively straightforward to understand. If it takes more effort to get the workers to the CBD, okay, then the rent really close in is going to be very expensive. And the other guys are going to have to pay high commuting costs. Because they have to pay high commuting costs, they're going to demand higher wages. That's going to make it more expensive to do business within the CBD. And again, since the firms have to break even, if they're going to be paying more in wages, that means they're willing to pay less in rent. Okay, so the water surrounding Seattle is basically going to dampen CBD rents in Seattle. Okay. Things that we're not taking into account, people are saying you've got that result, but CBD rents in Seattle are very high. Well, if there's amenity values for the water, then obviously that's going to offset this. If you've got a lot of residential units moving into the CBD because they want to be close to the firms, and they're competing for land in the CBD with the office guys, that's going to offset things. So there's a lot of things that can offset this effect. Okay, but we pretty much understand, how water and development constraints are going to affect CBD rents. Okay, for the residential rents, things can go either way. Okay, so there's two different channels here. The first one is the scarcity channel. And I would say the urban literature, at least of what I've seen, the emphasis is all on the scarcity channel. Okay, so the idea is there's less land to be developed. Because there's less land to be developed, then it necessarily follows that that land should be more expensive. Okay. The agglomeration channel goes the other way, and I don't think it's been emphasized much in the literature. Okay, the agglomeration channel is that if there's less developable land, okay, it makes it more expensive to put people in Seattle. If it's more expensive to put people in Seattle, it's going to have the feedback effect. It's going to make total factor productivity less. Okay, if that effect is strong enough, TFP is low enough, then having all the water in surrounding Seattle is going to actually make the wage rate in Seattle lower. Okay, and that can make the residential areas less valuable. Okay, so the residential rents can go either way. It depends on things like how much people like land in their consumption bundle, what does the transportation function look like, how much is agglomeration going to be benefiting from more people. Okay, Las Vegas again. Las Vegas is relatively unconstrained. Okay, so this is our unconstrained city, and the question is, under what conditions can a city like Las Vegas experience, a very strong amplification of a TFP shock, which is going to drive up the price of land? Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to go through this relatively quickly. The point that I want to just make now is, up till now I've been pretty much giving you intuition based on a static model. Okay, if I want to think about things like rent-to-value ratios and what happened in Las Vegas, we have to think more in terms of the dynamics. Okay, so in the dynamic model, it's basically the same thing, except the amplification due to agglomeration is going to occur at a lag, and we're going to add capital at a lag. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is what I'll call this virtuous cycle. And again, thinking in terms of Las Vegas, we have a city with weak supply constraints. Okay, so it's easy to build and expand Seattle. So this scarcity channel is not there at all. And we're going to say we've got a shock that attracts people and capital, capital with a lag, which is going to create the TFP and basically this snowballing effect that we already talked about. Okay, so the point here is, in this type of model, what's going to happen is we're going to get a shock to Las Vegas. We're going to say that as an entertainment center, Las Vegas has become more important. People are thinking of it as a tech center. So the central part of Las Vegas is viewed as being a positive TFP shock. Okay, Las Vegas doesn't have big constraints on expansion. So we know that we can basically stuff lots and lots of people into this CBD and magnify and amplify this TFP shock. Enough land so that rental values on residential land aren't going to go up a lot. Okay, but over time it's going to snowball. Okay, so what's going to happen is that the rents are going to increase relatively slowly because this is going to take time. Okay, but since this is a rational finance model where everything is valued in the land immediately, the land prices jump up immediately, even though the rents and the wages do not. Okay. These are just certain comparative statics in terms of what are the ingredients that you would need to get this. It's important that you can substitute away from land, okay, because the amount of land in the CBD is fixed. Okay, so if firms need a lot of land to do what they want to do, then as the land prices go up, they're going to leave the CBD. Okay, if you can substitute away from the land, you know, build higher buildings, then the land prices will go up much faster. Okay, so the fact that the land is scarce isn't going to drive firms out of that CBD to somewhere else. They just use the land more efficiently. Strong agglomeration benefits low capital response and less constrained residential areas with efficient transit. So what we did was we, here's just a few things that we simulated here. So the standard cap rate is 5 here. So in a steady state where nothing's likely to change, the interest rate is 5%, so the rent to value ratio is 5%. Okay, so what we're doing is impulse responses where we shock the firm with a large exogenous shock to total factor productivity. Okay, and that causes a small increase in rent and a large increase in value because of this snowballing effect. And so we're looking at a rail-based city versus a car-based city. Okay, so the difference in the rail-based city than the car-based city is this city is not going to be subject to such transit congestion as this city. Okay, and so we're looking at various ways of doing it, but in the case where you've got strong agglomeration, slow adjustment of capital, and a rail-based city, that's going to be the city where you're going to get the minimum cap rate, and you get about 4% for that. And then in a car-based city, if you've got fairly quick adjustment, your cap rate doesn't go down very much when you get a strong shock. Okay, so the idea for the car-based city is you get a strong shock. Okay, that's good for the businesses. They start hiring more people, and as they hire more people, they're basically having to pay a higher wage. They have to pay a higher wage because the city is basically pretty congested, and as you're bringing in more people, the marginal cost of bringing that additional worker into the CBD is very high. So there's just very little that the commercial rents are going to increase even after you get the shock. Okay, so the other way to put it is this type of city, in terms of the market values of the land, that's going to be very, very volatile relative to this type of city. Okay, I guess I'm pretty much out of time. Again, this is my story on Las Vegas. You've got this booming entertainment and tech center around the 2005, 2006. You can tell me, Ed, whether this is completely far-fetched. But the narrative would be that, hey, Las Vegas is going to attract all these tech firms that are priced out of Silicon Valley. They're going to go to Las Vegas. It's going to have this snowballing effect. So land prices go up a lot, even though rents don't change very much. And this virtuous cycle is sort of nipped in the bud in 2006, and everything crashes. Okay, now the reason why I want to mention this is that my hometown, Austin, you could tell exactly the same story. Okay, so Austin, again, is this featureless plain, no development constraints. People are basically telling the exact same story they were telling about Las Vegas, was all the California companies are going to move out of Silicon Valley because it's too expensive and move to Austin. The point I would like to make here is it's the same story. Austin also reacted at the same time. Okay, the point here is that obviously in Las Vegas it was an overreaction, but at the same time in Austin it was an underreaction. Okay, so you'd say Austin underreacted to this shock. Some cities overreact, some underreact. So it's hard to tell the bubble story. Okay, it's more of a story of sometimes we overreact, sometimes we underreact, and we can cherry pick our cases and pick out the bubbles ex post. That in a model, the moving pieces that are important are the agglomeration benefits, the development constraints, and the transit technologies. And we've got endogenous rents and values and cap rates. I do not do any calibration, so I can't say whether we can match the data with this at all, but sort of we can get sort of the intuition of what's driving cap rates and volatilities.